Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I'm in my car today. I tried doing the video from home, and then I just ran out of time while I was doing the recording, so now I got to start all over. I was gonna wait until tomorrow morning so I could do it in the home office because I like having that continuity, but I didn't really want to wait anymore because like now I got a good chunk of time where I can sit and do the video with you guys. But today I wanted to talk about this question that I got on Instagram a little while ago. Someone asked me, how do you think Puratan Sikhs dealt with things like PTSD? And I thought this was such a great question. I really wanted to take some time to think about it and write down some notes. And this is something that I have thought a lot about in the past. But maybe you guys have too. So I'd love to hear you guys' questions and comments and stuff about it. I'm sure you guys might have thought about something that I haven't thought of yet. But you know, I think there's a bigger discussion to be had here, but we'll talk about that at the end, I guess. So before I get into the video, I want to put a disclaimer here and a trigger warning. So I'm going to be talking about things that are very violent and graphic in nature. I'm going to be talking about mental health and more negative aspects of mental health. So if that might upset you or it might trigger you, and if that's the case, then maybe, you know, pass on this video or pick the right time and place to watch it where that's more appropriate. The other disclaimer that I want to have for this video is that I'm going to have a fairly high-level conversation with you about Sikh, and I'm not going to take a ton of time to explain every single thing and all the jargon or the lifestyle or whatever it is. So if you have questions about that stuff and you want to know more because maybe you're not that well versed in, you know, the couple instances of Sikh history and whatever that I'm going to be referencing, then please just send me an email, or you can write me, you can reach out to me on social media, or you can, you know, send me something in the comments. I prefer direct messages because like when you start posting stuff in the comments, you get like this legion of people a lot of times that sort of chime in. And sometimes it gets pretty unnecessary, but yeah, send me a private message if you guys have questions or you want to know more about more specific things, and I'm really happy to talk to you about it. Okay, so first things first. When I'm talking about PTSD then and now, how my people have dealt with it, I think it's really important to start with a recognition that there's a lot that's different between then and now. There's a huge cultural difference then and now. Remember, this took place in India in the 1600s. Well, that's the sort of period that I'm referencing. And well, like mid 1600s to the early 1700s. And you might even, actually, we can even extend this forward, not just through the latter half of the Guru period, through the Misl period, through the reign of Raja Ranjit Singh, all the way up to First and Second Anglo-Sikh Wars and the British occupation of India. So that's the sort of time frame that I'm looking at when we're thinking about, you know, sort of history from 1600s all the way through to the 1800s. So let's talk about this, the differences. The first thing that, a couple things that's different. The first thing is that the way that soldiers operate here in North America today is very different from what it was like fighting or being a soldier in the Sikh army, you know, let's say in the 1600s. Today, everything is done in bases. The military itself is a huge industry, right? Huge. There's tons and tons of infrastructure, and it blurs the lines between civilian and soldier, right? Everything is done on bases, on these really big bases. Soldiers live together in groups of, you know, thousands, you know, a lot of times, unless you're maybe like in the National Guard or something like that. And, you know, in which case it's like you're training still in like somewhat large groups, but not quite that big. It's very different from living on base. Also, like the military, like if you're here, like I was stationed in Alaska when I was in the military, and like there was no threat of violence or fighting or anything like that anywhere close to base. If I wanted to go to a combat zone, I had to travel an incredibly long distance overseas to go to a combat zone, and then I'm only there for about a year, right? Some people are there for 6 months, 12 months, 15 months, right? But it's different. It wasn't always like that, right? And so if you think back to the 1600s, there was not the massive infrastructure for the army like it is today, at least not for the Khalsa. Everything was much smaller scale. More times than not, people were just like sort of putting on different roles as the need arose. So you'd be with your home, with your family, working, tending to your business or to your crop or whatever it is. And then when there was a threat of war, you turned yourself into a soldier and you armed yourself and you went to war. It's very different. It's not like that here today. Also, the threat of violence was very close to home. Sometimes it'd be right in your backyard, or it's, hey, we need to go fight, and let's go ride out a little ways, a couple of miles or whatever, or, longer distance away from home, so that our family is not directly impacted by the war or seeing the violence of the fighting or whatever it is, right? And if you lost those battles, then you had a lot more at stake. Whole lot more at stake. It was much more personal than what it is today. That is important. We'll get back to that in a second. Also, war today, like when I was in Iraq, when I was in Afghanistan, it was, at least from the enemy combatant side, 100% asymmetric warfare. That means guerrilla tactics. We don't really use that term guerrilla anymore. We say asymmetric these days, but that's how it was. It's just like regular people. They're not uniformed most of the time, unless it's like a really huge operation on their part. But mostly they're not in uniform. There are no bases or training camps or whatever it is that they're staying at, and that's where they're launching operations out of, right? It's like you're just going to somebody's house in a village, and you have dinner with their family, then you have a private discussion with somebody somewhere else, right? And when you attack, it's more spontaneous or it's strategic, where it's very hit and run type deal. You never know. You never know when you're going to get hit, right? Whereas, 300 years ago, or and some, in early Sikh military history, right? The asymmetric warfare it didn't really start out as the norm. It sort of came to be that over time. But like if you're looking at the battles of Guru Hargobind Sahib Ji or Guru Gobind Singh Ji, then you're looking at a war that is fought over the course of major battles, several major battles, right? Sure, you might have hostile enemy territory, right, which you just would stay away from and you wouldn't go there. But for the most part, war took place on battlefields, right? Clearly defined battlefields. And that's not the case anymore. What that does to you and what you hold on to in terms of what's stressful and, sort of how you live your life day to day after the fact, maybe it'll affect you a little bit differently. All right, another really obvious thing is the nature of weapons. Kind of goes without say, right? When you think about historic battlefields, you think of, like Khalsa army, primary weapon, bow and arrow, pistols, long-range weaponry, right, is what you start out with. And then as you start to sort of exhaust whatever sort of projectile you have, you're closing the distance, and then it's, hand-to-hand combat. It's typically what we think of, like hand-to-hand combat in itself is typically what we think of when we think of historic battlefields. And hand-to-hand combat in today's world is incredibly rare. Very, very rare. Most of the time it's small arms fire, and if we can help it, then it's going to be indirect fire, so like artillery and attack aircraft. Now, that means, in summary, what that means is that the distances at which we conduct war have gone larger and larger over time. And so, like, we're trying to use our strongest and longest reaching, farthest reaching weapon against an enemy so that we can just reduce as much risk to loss of human life as possible, right? That's a modern trend. Also, the nature of the weapons, right? There's a big difference between you're on a battlefield and you're watching people be maimed or decapitated or chopped or bludgeoned, within inches of their life, or to death. That's a very intimate kind of violence, right? There's a difference between that and seeing people get shot. And there's different things that can happen to people when they get shot, and it all depends on the size of the round and where it hits you and what kind of cover protection that you have when it happens. But it's different, right? I mean, like, you have this sort of Hollywood style scenario, right? You've seen it in movies where someone will get shot in the stomach and then they just fall over and they die like almost instantly. It doesn't happen, right? That does not happen. It doesn't happen. Okay, can't stress that enough. It's not like that, right? You could get shot in the heart. You could get shot in the heart. Your blood is still pumping for 8 seconds, right? How far do you think you can run in 8 seconds? So how many more bullets do you think you can put down range in 8 seconds? People don't die right away, especially if you get shot in the stomach, right? Or even in one of your vital organs. You might get knocked out, but you're definitely going to get knocked back, knocked to the ground. If you got a weapon near you, if you're trying to get up and run or whatever it is, like, you can still do it for a little bit or maybe for a long while, right? And you keep on fighting until you just run out of strength or you lose too much blood or whatever. Sometimes if you get shot by a larger round, like, that's a different kind of thing of like just the shock and the gore behind that of what really large bullets and ordnances do to people, right? It's very different, and I don't think anyone, before World War One, right, could really imagine the scale of violence, right, of what these weapons are capable of these days. I don't really think they compare, but like, at the end of the day, like, losing your friend to violence or to death, like losing your friend because they were, killed with a sword or killed with a bullet or whatever, like that person's still gone at the end of the day, and that's what haunts you. A lot of the other feelings associated with that of, the guilt or the fear for your own life, or whatever it is, right? That still haunts you. That probably still stays consistent, but it's important to note, right? It's really, really important. I mean, like, today, like, we still have people who are flying drones, like, at a Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, right? But those drones are flying over, over the Middle East. And these drone pilots are getting PTSD even though they're in a completely different country halfway around the world. So it's like, it's very different, right? It's a very different experience of war, but killing is killing. The threat of death is still the threat of death, or the threat of violence is still the threat of violence, right? Okay, so culturally, there's also a lot of differences too. But maybe I'll save that for a second. So let me skip back in my notes here for a second. Okay. So when we talk about the differences between soldiers back then and soldiers now, we know that the violence doesn't really compare. The experience of how war is carried out does not really add up. For in some parts it does, but in some parts it doesn't. And the way that the military functions as an industry is very different, right? And that's going to be important. I guess I'll talk about that right now. I will say that my PTSD became really obvious, and like the severity of it became really obvious after I separated from the Army. And so, like, I did one deployment, then I got stop lost, then I did a second deployment, then they rushed me to get back, and then within 6 months of getting back, I was out, right? On terminal leave, getting, like, transitioning into the National Guard. And when I got out of the Army, I was in a completely different environment from the military. No one understood my language, no one understood my training, had any concept of what I had just been through. The values did not line up, the routines did not line up. Organizations within the community are not like, whatever safety network you have for getting help, whether that's, financial institutions, banking, or, like your landlord, whatever it is. Like, it's totally different from everything in the military. Their whole way of life changed. And for me, a big part of my struggle with my mental health is my inability to adapt to civilian life. And in a lot of ways, like, I feel that my inability to adapt was more damaging to me than the trauma that I suffered, right? Like, when you're in the Army, like, everybody's messed up, especially after deployments. Everybody's messed up, some people more than others, but we all went through it together, and we all understand that everybody's messed up, and we support each other as best we can, and we're all similarly like off kilter, right? Like, we all have the same dark sense of humor, we're all not really sleeping, we're all like, we can talk about our experience of what our trauma was, and that's not something I've been able to do as a civilian at all. I don't really talk about my deployments. I don't really talk about violence. I don't really talk about the job that I did, places that I've traveled to. For most of the people who know me, a lot of that stuff is a total mystery. They have no idea what I did. Sometimes I allude to it. Sometimes I'll say bits and pieces. But I don't talk to anybody about it. And I don't feel like I have people in my like civilian friends that can really relate to it. And then just being outside of the military environment, dealing with all these other foreign stressors that I wasn't used to when I was in the military, it was super stressful for me. Having that disconnect between the military life and civilian life, and feeling like I'm like a fish out of water, it was really, really distressing for me, right? But when I was still in, it wasn't distressing, and a lot of those things felt adaptive. And I think that is significant, because maybe there's a parallel there for Sikhs in the 16, 17, 1800s, right? If you don't have this huge industry and these huge frameworks for conducting war, right? Maybe it was just you and your jatha, right? Or you and people in your village, and you guys all went through it together, and you come back from the war, and you guys sort of live together, but there's no separation between being a soldier and being a civilian. You're just a warrior, right? You just have to keep training all the time. You have to maintain your weapons. You have to maintain your mindset all the time, right? And when your society needs you, then that's when they need you. When your village needs you, that's when they need you. And so there are other things that go into that as well too. Let me not move too fast. I want to paint some examples for you guys so that you guys kind of understand, like, sort of what I'm getting at here, because I don't want to be too elusive with what I'm saying. I'll tell you guys, when I was in Iraq, we would have signs in the back of the trucks every single truck, it says, stay back 100 meters, deadly force is authorized. There's something to that effect on the back of every single vehicle. So everywhere you go in the country, it's like you're traveling in a bubble, and people will come close to you. When I got back, like even when I was just on vacation, right? I'm in California. I'm driving front passenger seat, going through an intersection with an advanced green and seeing those cars coming right past me. I started having panic attacks in the car, like just driving down the highway, because that was so incredibly foreign to me. Like everything within me was like, if people come within 100 meters in their vehicle, like that person is like an incredible threat. You have to do everything you can to neutralize it. And here I am in a car all buckled up with no weapons, no armor, no soldiers around me, no recourse. I'm flipping out right in the car. And so like, what do? It's like, okay, you're in the civilian world, and then I just like, I think I'm gonna die, and like I feel like I'm having a heart attack when driving around the city. And that took a huge time to adjust to that, right? But that's like one example of how like a sort of failure to adapt to like the mismatch sort of in the environment really affected me, right? Another thing is like especially on my first deployment, we did a lot of clearing houses, right? And so if you don't know what that is, it's like when you'd have like a small team of guys, maybe 4 or 5 guys, well, maybe not 4, maybe 5 or 6 guys will go in a single file line, and then they'll stack up against a front door or somewhere to a house. One person kicks in the door, everybody else floods into the room, and you take a corner in the room, and then whoever's there, like you know, put them down on the floor, you might zip tie them or whatever it is. It's like a common thing in like police, you know, media, like in Hollywood or whatever, or like if you see soldiers clearing houses in movies. So anyways, I did a lot of that when I was in Iraq. And a huge core concept behind doing that is something called the fatal funnel, right? And that's essentially the doorway, right? So in the doorway, there's basically this cone of death. And you have to get it in your mind that if you stop in the doorway, you're like at the tip of the spear, and all of the bullets and enemy aggression or whatever can come at you in the doorway. And in order to get away from it, you have to get into the room, because then you have more cover, you have people who can come in behind you, and you can fan out when you get in. And so anyways, like in my mind, I had like this fatal funnel sort of idea all the time. Like I never really told myself to turn it off. And like after I was like living in California, eventually I started going to grocery stores and stuff. I'd walk into a store, someone would be like on their phone texting like this, and then would stop reading their messages, and then I'd be like, I'd have this moment of like, oh my gosh, fatal funnel. Like I would want to like kick this person over and like just run into the store of like, you can't stop in the doorway. Right? Even now, like I get so much anxiety, like standing in lines, like I can't deal. Right? So, because I had all this training and all this actual lived experience of rushing into doors and rushing into rooms and clearing houses, and like it never really got out of me. Right? So it's like, there are things like that. There are a bunch of things like this. Some of them revolve like the day-to-day stuff like that. Some of them revolve like episodes of violence that I was involved in. And so I have different triggers for different stuff, right? And so anyways, outside of the military context, when I'm in groups, or when I'm by myself, or if it's too quiet right around the house, you know, when I'm driving on the road, standing in lines, whatever it is, like all of these really harmless things, or relatively safe things that I do throughout my life are suddenly elevated to this level of being an extreme threat. And it's hard for me to really grapple with that every day and keep like trying to turn that sense off, right? And like here I am 10 years after Afghanistan, right? 10 years after Afghanistan, which is 2 years before I got out of the military. And I'm still with it, right? I'm still with it. So yeah, it's definitely a struggle that goes on every day. But I think more to that point of of sort of what else can cause like some other similarities, right? Of I'm switching topics here. What else can cause PTSD or how they dealt with it, right? So my experience of PTSD was worsened when I got out of the military and when I was in a very different environment that was hostile. I don't think, Sikhs in the 1700s really had that problem, right? You just live that lifestyle every single day. Okay, so let's talk about protective factors. Culturally, there's a lot of differences between then and now, but in Sikhi, it's a warrior culture first and foremost. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And the fact that it's a warrior culture means that it comes with a lot of protective factors that help people like me, right? And I'll tell you, when I think back about my experience in combat without Sikhi, I get one image. When I think about my experience after combat with PTSD, I have a different experience, right? I was two very different people. And then when I think about myself after combat with PTSD and in Sikhi helped me so much to grapple with a lot of the stuff that I was dealing with in my mind. A lot of my mental health stuff, and I want to get to this a little bit later on. But when we talk about things in the warrior culture that would help Sikhs in the 1700s, right? There's a lot there that probably did help them to cope a great deal with a lot of the violence that they saw. And I want to say it's important to note that like it wasn't just the soldiers who were fighting that saw a lot of violence. There are a lot of just victims of atrocities that saw a great deal of violence to themselves, to their children, to their families, to their homes. And there are a lot of bystanders as well, who saw a great deal of violence, just throughout their life. And maybe they were having a really hard time dealing with that too, right? So one thing is Chardadi Kala. So having that is really, really important. And it can help you a ton. It's helped me a ton. In the army, like everyone's got this like really big sense of humor. Like you almost have to. There's no way that you can really hold on to your sanity for very long if you don't have this sense of humor, right? And so it's like that's sort of like the North American equivalent, I think, to Chardadi Kala. That's probably the closest thing that non-Sikhs really have to it, of learning to like always see the bright side and always like try to make a joke out of everything or try to minimize the amount of pain that you can derive from a perceived experience. But like I think Sikhs, back in the day, had this Chardadi Kala, which was a huge tool in their tool belt. And no matter what they saw, it's like they're always like trying to say like, oh, it was Hukam, or they're always like trying to look on the bright side. They're whatever they do, like in all of their speech, they're using a lot of euphemisms that really talk about things like, and it would to most people would be like a really terrible or horrible situation, but to them, but like they're always making the most of it. Like, okay, these are cards that were dealt. We're gonna take it with a smile, right? So that would have been a huge protective factor for them. Another thing is Nithanem. Nithanem would be a huge protective factor for them, and Amrit Vela as well, even. So I'll tell you guys, like even now, with my PTSD 10 years after the fact, like I'm still like always having nightmares. It's hard for me to fall asleep. It's when I wake up, I'm up 2-3 times, sometimes every single night, just about. What do you do when you can't sleep and you're feeling distressed and you wake up and it's 4 a.m., right? Or 5 a.m. And then you're like, okay, do I want to go back to sleep? I don't really want to. I got a lot on my mind. My thoughts are racing, whatever it is. For me, like Nithanem helped me a ton. And this is something that like I'm kind of glad to talk about because not really something that I get to discuss very often with people. And it's like, it's something that's come up for me. I only make maybe once or twice in the last couple of years people want to talk about sort of what's some other things that really got me into Sikhi? Because when I talk about what got me into Sikhi, mostly I talk about like that there's a lot that makes sense coming out of the military and learning about the Khalsa. It makes perfect sense. Everything. Like, I remember the very first time that I heard the story of the Khalsa Sajna Divas in 1699, and you think about Guru Gobind Singh Ji asking for a head, right? I knew that feeling immediately, right? I knew that feeling of you don't even have to ask, right? I'll do it gladly. I'll do it willingly, right? I'll and like just the lengths that you go to on deployments or just in military life, like just out of love, is something that a lot of people in the civilian world don't understand. Like you probably, unless you're like a parent or a twin or something like that, like you don't know what it's like to love someone so much more than you love yourself, to the extent that a part of your self-concept is absorbed in that other person. Right? A lot of civilians don't understand that. You know, it's like you make friends from time to time and you might have falling outs. But, you know, in the military, it's like you make a friend, you guys, and then it's like you're so much more than that. So much more than just friends, right? And even if you guys get angry at each other, there's never once ever this, oh my gosh, I'm so done with you, right? Let me just like walk away from you and never talk to you again. That does, like, I've never seen that in the military, at least when I was in. I guess times are changing now these days. But like you invest in people, right? Again and again and again. And no matter what their behavior is, like you accept that person for who they are. Like you see them, you see the whole deal, right? Like if someone like people that I still talk to from my time in the military, like, you know, yeah, they might not like certain things about me, but like they have to take it because that's a part of who I am, right? And so it's like me too. Like there are people that I met in the military, I would not be friends with them if we just met in a civilian context. I'd be like, this is ridiculous and this is not what I stand for, so I'm done with this, right? But it's like, okay, I don't agree with your lifestyle choices, but like I still got to be here for you and support you because like we need each other at the end of the day, right? And then, you know, in combat, it's like, you know, like the group matters way more than the individual. Like the group is everything, right? So anyways, went on a tangent there, but getting back to Simran. Simran helped me a ton when I came back, and I was not in a good way when I came back from either of my deployments. I was having like a lot of distressing thoughts, a lot of major depressive episodes, thoughts of self-harm, thoughts of harming other people, just overall just really, really struggling and not really knowing how to pull myself together. And thank goodness, like I found Sikhi almost right after I got back from Afghanistan. Like I'm really glad for that. It's because it helped me so much. Like I would wear a mala like this. Like now, like I only really wear it on those days where I feel like I gotta pay way more attention to my Simran. But like I would bring a mala with me. And then I would have like these racing thoughts or like really distressing thoughts. And then I would take out my mala and I would count. Right, I go through the whole necklace, and it's 108 beads on every necklace, right? Or at least on like the standard ones, but it was 108, and I would go through Gur Mantar or Mool Mantar or some other, you know, Shabad or whatever that I was thinking of, and I would do it like maybe 20, 30 times in a row, right? And it was just never enough. But at the same time, it just emptied out all those other negative thoughts from my mind. Like it gave me something to do and something to focus on. And then, especially as I started like really studying the words and the language a whole lot more, like it totally started to change the way that I thought about things, right? It got to the point where I was like, what's the point in counting, right? And I would take this and then I would wear it on my wrist. So I tied it around my wrist a bunch, and every time I would do my Simran just automatically, or if I was just had a busy day and my mind was somewhere else, if my attention ever got called to that mala, then I would stop what I was doing and then I'd take some time to just start incorporating my Simran into my day. And so like all day, every day, just Simran all the time, right? And it really helped me to focus my thoughts and get my mind out of those really dark, negative places. There are other aspects of it, like mentally, where my Simran really helped me. I talked about Amrit Vela, like I have a lot of sleep disturbances. And, you know, when I was like shooting out of bed at like 3 a.m. or 4 in the morning, right, and I can't go back to sleep, guess what? I can do my bhakti in the morning. And so, like, that helped me a lot too. It's not just me pacing around the house, not knowing what to do with myself anymore, or keeping busy to try to distract myself from this thing that is clearly following me everywhere that I go, right? So, like, it allowed me to totally change my whole inner dialogue. And so, like, waking up in the morning, certainly, like, almost right away, like, became something that I wanted to look forward to, because now I have this thing that gives me this peace of mind and this stillness, you know, where there was all of this distress beforehand. All right, and then another thing, like, where Simran really helped me out was that, you know, when I came back from both of my deployments, I had like this very severe sort of dissatisfaction with being alive in general. It was just like, not just civilian life, but just being alive. It was like this sort of existential fatigue, you know, that I have. And I still have that today, but like, because of Sikh, like, it's like I put a very different spin on it. And like having that time for my Simran, and like there's like this sort of ongoing message throughout Gurbani where it's always, you know, talking about, you know, non-detachment, talking about detachment, and talking about being like dead while you're still alive, and keeping your relationship with a Kalpurk as sort of like the center of your life and the center of your day every day. And like, when, like, suddenly, like, now when I'm thinking about this, you know, sort of existential angst that I have that's lingering, I'm not thinking about it in terms of like, you know, man, I can't wait, right? Like, I just ready to get off this ride, just get me out of here. I'm not thinking about it like that anymore. And now I'm thinking about like the next step, like preparing for you know, when my time is up, right? Like, I want it to count. I want to be brave. I want to end this life with courage, right? And I'm thinking about on all the time leading up to that, right? Like, I'm going to be judged after that. And am I ready for that part too, right? Like, yeah, I made a lot of mistakes, but how much time have I invested in myself and in my community or in the world to try to fix that and repair that as much as I can, right? And then so now I'm like, now Seva is a really big deal of like turning the lens back on myself for a moment and then turning it back out and be like, okay, now it's time to get out into the world and do as much good as I can, right? But I still have this constant ongoing detachment or whatever. So Simran really helped me a ton with that. And let me flip back to my other page here. When I think about Sikhs in 1600s, 1700s, or whenever, like before, I'd say like, you know, the age of modern warfare, I would say that it probably helped them a lot too, right? With whatever they were grappling with and with their Sikhi. Nityanam was really important. Amrit Vela is really important. Ret, having that personal discipline. I'll tell you guys, like when I was a soldier, like there were a lot of times where I feared my sergeants more than I feared the enemy, right? And like just like having that respect every single day, the routine every single day of like you wake up and personal hygiene and, you know, a lot of attention to detail to your uniform and like all of the decorum, you know, stuff that I had to pay attention to, cleanliness, like, you know, in your room, on base, the barracks or whatever. It did a lot of really good, it did a lot of good for my mental health, you know, in those days too. So I know that the Ret for Sikhs once upon a time was probably a good protective factor for them as well, I would imagine. Another thing that those Sikhs had that we don't have today, well, at least I didn't have when I was in the army, was elders and heroes, right? Like when I first got to my unit, everybody was brand new. They started that unit from scratch, right, at that time when I got there. And that unit had been out of commission since Vietnam. Then they started it up again, and like they only had like a couple of sergeants from other airborne units around the globe. And everybody got sort of fast-tracked through promotion so you could take on more responsibility, and we got to get these guys up and running and ready for deployment in 2 years. And it was just hot and heavy all the way up until we got boots on the ground in Iraq. When they're talking about what does it mean to be a paratrooper and life in the airborne and life overseas, like not everybody who had a rank had a really difficult deployment or saw a lot of violence or whatever on their deployments. I was like very fortunate that I worked with someone who did. Like, we're still friends to this day, and like his guidance, like, and his leadership style, like, really saved my life so many times. But not everybody gets that, right? And when I think about in Sikh, you have so many heroes and so many people to look up to, especially Guruji, first and foremost, that it's just like you have this sort of golden standard to try to meet and live your life by. And like having that cultural heritage can really help you feel like you're part of something so much greater, right, than yourself. And here we are hundreds of years later, and we have so many stories about shaheeds, from Sikh history and their contribution. And, it's impossible to say anything negative about them because it was almost miraculous, like a lot of the things that they did, right? So that probably would have been a huge protective factor for Sikhs, a few hundred years ago. You had people who were seasoned war veterans who could tell you what to expect, who trained you very, very well. Things like Chatka as well would have been a huge help. I think, like, a huge asset for them to prepare them for war as well, and to keep them constantly ready to get their mind right, for taking a life. I don't know if you guys know this. It might be the first time you've ever heard of this before, but you can look it up. Killing another human being is just one of the hardest things that you can do. There is something in you that is biological, I think, that really tells you don't do it, right? This overwhelming majority of people cannot bring themselves to do it. And when I was in the military, we had to jump through so many hoops to try to get you to that point, right? I've got some stories. I've got so many stories about, like, people not being willing to do it, right? In combat, like, people are shooting at you, or people are setting up bombs in the road, and like, you drive down that road all the time, you're just going to let them put the bomb in and walk away and, not do anything about it, right? No, absolutely not, right? And so, like, but there's still always this question in people's minds, like, oh man, I don't think I should. Part of that is because you have this impulse, overwhelming impulse, not to kill people, right? And then another part of it is the legal aspect of it, right? Which is a huge part in today's society. But, like, Chatka is something that teaches you so much respect, so much compassion for other living beings, the seriousness and the gravity of taking a life, the importance of maintaining your weapons, the importance of ritual, right, and of purpose and meaning, right, and just in everything that you do in your life. And there's so many benefits around it, at least for warriors, right, that it's just like, it would have been a huge asset for them to have something like that and have elders that could guide them through that and help prepare them for war. Also hunting as well, a huge asset for people in those days, not just because as a preparation for war, but even for war veterans, coming back from these major battles, and you have your own anxiety and everything, and like the hunt would have been like a huge opportunity for catharsis, or for releasing whatever pent up frustration, and even that urge for combat that just never really goes away. It's hard to describe. Like, all of your adrenaline and your cortisol and everything is just so incredibly high in combat. You feel so alive. You feel more alive in 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 2 hours of combat than you will in 50 years of civilian life, of like skydiving, roller coasters, and traveling the world, and scuba diving or whatever. Like, nothing at all compares to combat. nothing at all. And so it's just like, even still, like, sometimes people ask me, like, are you glad to be out of the military? And I'm like, absolutely, I'm glad to be out of the military. But do you miss it? Absolutely, I miss it every single day. Like, every day of my life, I miss being in combat. I miss being in the army, right? But still, like, I'm not going back to it, but it's in the back of my mind, right, all the time. Anyways, I guess a part of that is having a mission too is really important. This is one of the reasons why I got out of the army, because I started to have a lot of ambivalence about how I was feeling about, what I was being asked to do, just sort of as an agent of the state, right, in another country doing all these operations. And I was like, am I really doing the most good here? Is this really what I want to be doing with my life? Do I feel like I'm actually helping these people, or am I a part of a much bigger problem? And I had all these other questions that I didn't really have the time to really grapple with. And I was on the fence. I didn't make up my mind one way or the other, but I was leaning more towards, I don't think I should be a part of this anymore, right? And so, like, I got out. It took me a very long time. I'm still processing a lot of this stuff many years after the fact. But, like, when I came into Sikh, and, like, I'm thinking about, this call to action from Guru Gobind Singh Ji of Deg, Teg, Jag Mein, Do Chale, right? That Deg and Teg, prosper in the world, right? That was something that I could get behind 110%, right? Learning about, like, the history of the Khalsa, the Guru's mission and their message, I was like, that is something I can get behind 110%, right? So those Sikhs, having had that, man, even having, going into battle with Guruji themselves, oh my gosh, right? There's no way that you ever have, like, a thought of defeat in your mind, right? Like, sometimes I think about it, like, you ever think about the Battle of Anandpur, and Guru Gobind Singh Ji hands this Nangani Barcha to by Bachittar Singh, and is like, go fell this war elephant that's charging at us, and like you take it and you get it done. You have no thought in your mind, Guruji said I can do it, right? like, just think about the kind of conviction that they had, right? Not just like with the relationships they had amongst themselves, but just like, just being able to serve with Guruji. Like, I can't imagine an experience like that. Like for a warrior, it must have been like blissful, to love someone so deeply and to put your life on the line for them, So yeah, heroes, the mission, Red Hukam, elders, being Tyar Bar Tyar, we'll get back to that later. Nityanam Chartka Chardidikala. And okay, language. Okay, so with all those things that I just said, that's my list of protective factors and things that I think really helped Puratan Sikhs to cope with a lot of the distress that they might have had from their time in battlefields, or just by seeing really horrific violence from a lot of the state orchestrated oppression, of minority groups in India at that time. So how do I think they dealt with it? That's how I think they dealt with it. I think they had a lot of systems in place within the culture and within the community that helped them to cope. Now, on the other hand, I think that maybe there are other ways where they didn't deal with it, right? This is something that I've thought about, like in terms of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, right? Born with the name Tyagmal, went into battle, was, a war hero essentially, and their father was like, you're not Tyagmal, like you're Tegh Bahadur, like you're so good and so brave on the battlefield, right? And think about like Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's response to that, right? And to all of their exploits in combat, it was, I don't derive any pleasure from this at all. I just want to do what the Guru says, right? Sometimes I think about that, right? Like, it gives me a little bit of insight on where their mind might have been. And I wonder if their early experiences, right, like as a teenager in combat, really shaped their worldview, right? Of like being a renunciate and living in solitude for years and years at a time, and spending so much of their life, towards bhakti, right? Not just Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, but even Baba Gurditta. I wonder how they were impacted, not just by the battle, but by things like, watching Bande Khan, fall in battle. Sometimes I think about my Bago, right? Again, a teenager, right? You're living this homely life, taking care of the family, life around the village while all the men are away at war. At that time, it was, leading up to the Battle of Chumkor. And, all these men come back, and then you learn about the Badava and, all these deserters. And then that totally changed her life, right? Not only was she like leading them back in the battle, but like being the sole survivor of her Jatha, right, at the Battle of Muxar. I wonder what that did to her, because like as far as I know, she never went back to normal life. Like once she picked those swords up, she never put them down. Right? Sometimes I think about that. Like you weren't a soldier anymore. You went to be a bodyguard for Guru Gobind Singh Ji after that. You lived your life like very humbly and just spent all of your time after that focusing on your bhakti. I wonder what that experience of combat, of what battle was like for her, and how that totally changed her mindset, right? Of like there was something about that she couldn't shake anymore, right? And so now like her whole life changed, so to help her cope with that. Sometimes I think about that, right? And when I think about like sort of all of these epic tales of valor and heroism by Nahang Singhs throughout the ages, of like even leading up to when the British were trying to invade India in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and you think about, on average, one Nahang Singh on horseback, right, with their bow and arrow and their pistols and chakras, could kill 14 British troops before they died. Think about that, right? How can you think of maybe five or, like less than 20 Nahang Singhs could go up against a force of 200 or 300 strong and could crush them? Think about that. Like what kind, like how they, think about what drives you to that, right? That doesn't just happen overnight. That doesn't just happen by good training alone, right? There's other stuff going on, right? And I know people, I was one of them, where you're in combat and you see some stuff after a while, and then just this fear of dying, or just like, I know I should do more to protect myself because like I don't want to be a casualty and be a burden to other people around me, but like you just don't care at all. Like you just run straight into it, and there's no thought in your mind of like the worst case scenario, right? Like you're just totally fearless, and like not in like a heroic kind of way either. It's like in a reckless way, right? And so I wonder, like a lot of people like Hari Singh Nalwa fighting tigers like with daggers, right? Like come on, like this is a very special kind of person that doesn't just happen overnight, right? You think about the kind of combat that they saw and how it changed them, and like for better, maybe for worse, right? And maybe there are other ways where like Nahang Singhs back in the day maybe weren't dealing with it, right? And like if you think about like having night terrors or being more disconnected from friends and family or whatever it is, like there's sometimes I think about that in terms of like the sheer lack of positive male influences within the Punjabi community today. And I wonder how much of that goes back to this time of where people were affected so much by their trauma. Like it's hard to be at home. You want to get out. You need to keep your mind busy. And so it's just like, okay, I'm just going to distract myself with seva all the time, all day, every day, and neglect my family. I've seen it happen to people that I know very well, right? They get home and they can't deal. They hear a crying baby, and then they're just like at an 11. Immediately, I have to leave, right? I know I've met people who go home and have all kinds of problems over like the littlest things. Like just have to get out of the house. They can't stay home. Like they're not the same people when they come back, right? And so it's like I know that PTSD, for the effect that it has on the soldier, also has a massive effect on the families, right? And like one aspect of it that I do want to talk specifically about is like having flat affect, and this detachment from people and from everything, really. But like when I was me as a young paratrooper and, you know, supporting the infantry, and like you're always taught, like when you're going through battle drills, like everything is about cutting off your emotional centers and eliminating the threat, right? So that now battle is not about the objective, it's about all the technical stuff in between that you have to make sure that you're doing properly every step of the way. That's what it's really all about, right? It's about finding cover, you know, putting down your weapons for support, laying down suppressive fire, loading ammo, you know, into machine guns, you know, calling sit reps back towards command centers or calling in for assets, whatever it is. Like you're just focusing on all the technical stuff of the job to make sure you get everything right. And you're not at all thinking about people are shooting at me. You're not thinking about, okay, I have to, you know, who is it out there and what am I going to do to them? You're not thinking about that at all, right? It's just move and counter move and muscle memory every step of the way. And so it's like there's no room in that for panic. It will kill you, right? Panic will kill you. And so, you know, when you come back, like when I came back, no one ever talked to me about shutting that off. Nobody ever told me that that was going to be a problem, right? But it was a problem for everyone across the board. Everyone had a hard time coming back, visiting with their family, seeing their spouses, seeing their kids, trying to get back to like a normal routine of life. It was impossible for some people, right? For a lot of people, it was impossible, and families were torn apart left, right, and center, and it's really, really tragic, right? And so it's like that's one thing, is like this level of detachment that I have from other people in my relationships. Emotionally, like it's hard, like impossible, basically impossible for me to get excited about stuff. Like, you know, like people are happy and they're laughing and they're having a great time. Like, okay, I'm there, I'm enjoying myself as much as I can, but I'm not at that level with you of like side-splitting laughter or really, you know, in the moment, like I'm happy for you, or, you know, crying or whatever it is. Like I don't feel like I have it in me anymore, right? And so like, I don't know, that I'm sure that did have a big effect on Nahung Singhs and their families, you know, a few hundred years ago. Yeah, getting out of the house, and like now it's all about, you know, dating your family, married to your warrior lifestyle, or marrying seva, right, and dating your family, kind of thing. So yeah, that's probably that. It could be a factor of like in what ways did they not deal with it. Another way that they might not have dealt with it is with when you look at the progression over time of like this sort of like almost like, I don't know, like we have like this kind of hindsight bias, right? But it's like when you look back at like the missile period, this long ongoing period of conflict between all the different groups, when you think back to rising tensions between Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims, you know, all the way through when the British were there, and after, in the creation of Pakistan. That didn't just come out of nowhere, right? And I wonder if this generational trauma from, you know, this incredibly long, just nonstop period of war had a lot to do with that, right? And especially a lot of like the anti-Muslim sentiment that does exist in threads throughout like the South Asian communities, right? Like a lot of that, I'm sure, is like tied to war or like pride, you know, and like your affiliation with which side of history you landed on, right? And like, again, I think that's generational trauma that's really seeping through from people who were very directly affected by a lot of this prejudice and hatred, and systemic oppression that was happening in India at that time. So I wonder if that's a big part of it. What else? Okay, another thing that I was going to say about not dealing with it is that, remember how I said when I got out of the military, like that's when it really was noticeable that I had PTSD, right? When I was in the army, a lot of this stuff felt adaptive, right? It was good that I wasn't really sleeping as much because I needed to be more alert and I needed to be awake before my other soldiers and ready, beforehand, and, walk into, the operations center and sort of be abreast of what's been going on operationally while I was out or whatever. It made more sense to be more on edge and to be more paranoid and have more like attention to detail and suspicious of everyone. Like all of these things where I was in a period of danger because of like something really innocuous, right? Whether that's things with roadside bombs or, small arms fire or whatever it was that I experienced. Like I felt like those things kept me alive, and it was good that I had that edge to me at that time. So for Singhs a few hundred years ago, a lot of the stuff they probably didn't deal with because they didn't really see it as a problem, right? If you need to stay ready all the time, you're like, okay, yes, I have a family, I have a business, I serve my community, right? And like it's war every now and then, right? You're constantly training, and like that threat of war, the threat of my community is constantly under attack and always has to be like looking over your shoulders and not knowing who you can trust. Like that feels adaptive, right? The sleep disturbances and night terrors, and you're waking up and you're doing your nitnem and like Amrit Vela, you're like, well, I'm up anyway, like I might as well just do more Simrat, right? Like, okay, I can't sleep, but instead of just like investigating all of those thoughts and all of those emotions and allowing myself to grieve, I'm just gonna take it for what it is, right? It is what it is. It's Hukam, and now it's time for Nitnem, right? And like for me, like Nitnem had a massive benefit on me because of a lot of the stuff that I was struggling with. But at the same time, like it didn't fix everything, right? It fixed a bunch of stuff, but it didn't fix everything. It changed my perspective on a lot of things that I was suffering with, but it didn't take away that suffering entirely. And there are other stuff that I had to do to start incorporating into my life and start studying more and thinking about in very different ways to try to overcome a lot of the hurdles that were put there by my experience in combat. So yeah, if you're struggling with a lot of this mental health stuff, if it's warranted, you're not going to think of it as a problem, right? It's keeping you alive, it's keeping your community safe, it's keeping you prepared for that day that you hope doesn't come, but you suspect is coming anyway, of I need to be able to put my life on the line and stand up and fight, an oppressive regime. So, did they deal with it? Did they not deal with it? Yes and no. I think it was a little bit of both, but who knows, right? I haven't found any literature that really addresses this, because mental health is like this as an idea. Mental health as an idea of something worthy of study, something worthy of deep consideration, and how it affects people and how it affects cultures and groups of people over long periods of time is kind of a new thing, right? We didn't really start looking into this until the World Wars, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating. I would love to have like a deeper discussion with someone who is a lot more well-informed and well-educated on Sikh history or whatever, on like what they might know about this stuff, what kind of safety measures there are for like Nahang Singhs a few hundred years ago, and how they coped and what they did to try to not really enjoy the rest of their life, but like cope with a lot of their suffering and their anxiety and like keep pushing forward. Okay. I think that's it for my talking points. So, yeah. I guess the last thing I'll say about this is that when it comes to things like mental health and PTSD, some people are a lot more resilient than others. Not everybody's experience is the same. Some people see way more violence. And some people see way less violence. Some people need to see much less violence or even vicariously experience violence in order to get PTSD. Sometimes it's not even that you see something happen to you or have something done to you. Sometimes it's just the fear that it's going to happen can cause PTSD, right? And so it's like everyone's situation is a little bit different. And, you know, coming out of the military and, you know, dealing with this for years and years after the fact, and, you know, every single person I've ever met who's, you know, in the military and was out for 10, 15, 20 years, you know, I've yet to meet people who have really like 100% recovered. You know, like, yeah, you're gonna be a little bit different. Like, I'm trying to find my new normal now. But like, this is one of those things where I wish that I had someone who was able to come before me and say, listen, this is what it's going to be like afterward. And, you know, you owe it to yourself and to the people that you care about to get as much help as you possibly can. It's not a sign of weakness, right? You deserve this. And like, like a part of me does kind of resent the Army and like just the lack of support for mental health, you know, for soldiers or for anyone who serves whatever country that they live in, right? It's like, at least in my experience in America and from what I've heard from Canadian veterans as well, who are really struggling with getting help from their service-connected injuries. Like, if you serve, no matter what capacity you serve in, if you serve your community, you deserve absolutely every resource at that community's disposal to get you back on your feet, right? So yeah, I would love if somebody came and told me, hey, this is how hard it's going to be, right? Or this is how hard it was for me, but you don't have to do that, right? Use these resources, you know, surround yourself with people who are here to support you, and like, you can, you know, help to sort of inoculate your friends and your family of like, hey, I have PTSD, and, you know, this is what I'm going through. I'm not the same. Like, I need you to work with me, and, you know, seeing healthcare professionals and whatever else that you're doing. So yeah, and that goes back to why I'm sort of why I made this channel, right? Is like, I need this space to process, to talk about a lot of this stuff. And I'm putting it out there instead of just making all this stuff private. I'm putting it out there because I know I'm not the only one. I know that there are other people out there who would benefit from my experience, right? I hope it's enough that I can tell you that I had this horrific experience in combat, and in the Army across 2 deployments, and it changed my life forever, and not necessarily in a good way. And it didn't have to be this hard, right? And I was in such denial when I first got out of the Army, about how bad things were. And like, I didn't want to believe it. Like, I kept thinking it was going to be better, right? Like, you know, they gave us safety briefings right when we got back. They say, listen, you're going to come back and you're going to be a little on edge, and, you know, emotions might be running a little bit high. You're going to be forgetting things a lot. You're not really going to have an appetite or want to sleep or want to spend time with your friends, with your family. It's okay. What you need is time to relax and unwind. That's what you need right now. And they're like, and trust me, everything's going to go back to normal. It's going to be better. Here I am, 10 years after Afghanistan, my last deployment, and it's never gone back to normal, right? And, you know, I know I'm not the only one. It's got to be a lot of other people out there. So if this, you know, if whatever I'm saying in these videos helps to serve even just one other person, then, you know, that's good enough for me. But, you know, mostly this channel is for me to get a lot of these thoughts out of my head. So in any case, thank you guys for sticking with me through my very long, hour-long discussion on this. I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts are on what's your take on this. How did puratan Sikhs, right? Not just Nihang Singhs, but also bystanders of atrocities and victims of atrocities as well. How do you think they coped with their PTSD, or things like this idea of mental health and what protective factors that they have? And I'd love to hear more, like, what your thoughts of are on about this. Maybe you know of more things in the histories that I don't know of, and more examples that I don't know of people really overcoming this, or other effects. How else does it affect people, and what else do we have culturally that protects us from things like these mental health disorders? But thank you guys so much for watching. Please reach out to me anytime if you guys want to talk more about this kind of stuff, or if there's things that maybe I didn't explain very well, I kind of glossed over in my talk today. I would love to hear what you have to say about it. But you can reach out to me online on social media. I'm always available to people who send me direct messages or whatever, because it's my honor and privilege to be able to talk about this stuff and to try to help the next generation, as much as I can, or like other people in the community, in the global community now. The world's getting smaller. But yeah, I'll leave it here for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I guess we'll see you next time. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.